Good afternoon, Nadia. This is a great pleasure. Nadia Al-Sakkaf is a pioneering journalist of great courage. She is the editor of an independent newspaper in a poor, patriarchal, and tribal society that's undergoing radical change in the heart of a tumultuous region with enormous implications for the entire world. She is a brave woman in a culture with few visible women and no other women editors. And she is an activist working at the highest levels for a successful transition of Yemen to democracy and equitable development. And finally, she is a bridge from a culture that is centuries old to a new and radically different one in a matter of just a few short years, a historical blink of the eye. A bridge to a world with much hope, but also much peril. Nadia, when we hear of Yemen, until very recently, we think of poverty, a failing state, few human rights, especially for women, and as a harbor for terrorists, even Al-Qaeda. Now, with the Arab Spring, with a Yemeni woman sharing a Nobel Peace Prize, with a revolution that's less bloody than many others in the region, the perception of your country is beginning to change. But how do you feel today about your country's image?
Thank you, Elliot. I do feel very great about the times we are going through in Yemen today, because it is a time for transition and changing the image or the stereotypes about my country in the eyes of the world. I take myself as a person or a woman on a mission, and my mission is to change the way the world looks at Yemen and the way Yemen presents itself to the rest of the world. And I do this through my work as an editor of the Yemen Times, as well as an activist promoting democracy, human rights, especially for women, and freedoms as such.
As a journalist, given the perception of Yemen, and indeed many of the other Arab countries in your neighborhood, do you feel let down by your fellow journalists?
That's true. I have a problem with journalists who come to my country. We call them parachuting journalists. They jump into the country for 2 days, write a story about Al-Qaeda, and go back to their countries thinking they know everything they need to know about Yemen. And it's not fair. It's not fair to me, or it's not fair to my country. I believe journalism is a noble profession, and journalists should take the time to do the research. And there are morals to be done, and we've seen this in the earlier presentations this morning when they said it's only bad news if it's taken, or the media promotes only bad news. And there's much more to Yemen than this. And journalists should take some time to do their job properly. This is what we do in Yemen Times, actually. I try to push my team, boys and girls, or men and women. I try to promote professional, ethical journalism, look for the right story, why, ask why. We have a rule that says if your mother says she loves you, check. So we have to keep checking until we find the truth.
You mentioned boys and girls. I mean, tell me about, it has to be very difficult being a woman as the editor-in-chief. Do you also have women working for you? What is that like in a traditional, conservative, patriarchal society?
Well, it's true. It was very difficult for me, especially in the beginning, as a female editor and relatively young age. The male journalists, the more they call themselves established journalists, didn't like having a female boss. And in a country like Yemen, the male domination is very much there. You can feel it from my side. But I try to promote women, and I try to promote female journalists. I encourage them to work outdoors, and some of the girls had to wear veils. And I try to convince them that you have to take off the veil if you're going to be a journalist. The people you're talking to need to see your face. And so that was one of the transitions I tried to promote through my work as an editor.
How dangerous is it to be a journalist, and especially a female journalist? You didn't mention, and I think the audience would want to know. Your father, who was the founder, editor of the paper, was actually murdered. How dangerous is it for you? Journalists in that part of the world we read regularly, they're harassed, they're intimidated, sometimes they're even tortured, sometimes they're murdered. Talk to us about that.
Yemen is an emerging democracy. We've come a long way since the paper was established in 1990. And my father gave his life for his profession in 1999 when he died in a car accident, a plotted or what we believe was a plotted car accident. And journalists have been harassed, abducted, killed. For me personally, luckily I did not go through the extreme part of it, so I was not arrested or detained. I was harassed several times. I received threatening phone calls and so on. My staff, when we send them to the field, I have to think very carefully before I send a reporter to cover a story if he or she is going to be at risk, and this is something we have to weigh carefully. Today, the situation is much better. Maybe it's because of the Arab Spring, or maybe because the long fight since the early 90s until today has brought its fruit. And I believe that freedoms of press generally in Yemen is developing very nicely. We have a radio station now in Arabic, Radio Yemen Times, and although it's unlicensed, but we sort of challenged the authority and went ahead and set up the radio station despite what the government may think.
And the danger, the intimidation, the harassment, it's not only coming from government in power or influential people in the private sector. It's also coming from a criminal mafia, from warlords and tribal chiefs. I mean, it's complicated, isn't it?
Yemen is very complicated. You'd find a parliamentarian who's a businessman, who's a sheikh in a tribe, and who also runs a weapons deal behind closed doors. So it's not only, our problem is not with the state alone. We have a problem with authorities. We also have a problem with influential businessmen whom we step on their toes when we report on stories of corruption, for example. We have a problem with gangs. Once one of my reporters was investigating a story on prostitution, and while he was following the lead after a lead, it turned out that some influential mafia sort of people were behind it, and they actually threatened him. They said, "You stop the investigation here or you lose your life." So he came to me and he said, "What do I do?" And of course, no, your life is more important to me than following a story. And so we do have to face a lot of problems, and sometimes advertisers, they don't like some of the stories and they pull out their advertisements, and since we're an independent newspaper, we have to, lick our wounds and recover from the losses.
Well, those are lessons, obviously, for many countries, not just your own. The enemies of free press are really the enemies of democracy and equal opportunity. You mentioned the Arab Spring, and I think everyone would be interested in your own observations. The world was so excited about what we saw, starting in Tunisia and in Tahrir Square in Cairo. But where are we today? Where is the Arab summer? It seems when you look at Syria and look at many other places that we're in a long Arab winter. What do you see?
Well, it started in 2011. We're now end of 2012, and luckily for Yemen, the fate of the Arab Spring is not as bloody as Syria, for example. We've landed up a political agreement, but it's taken a very long time to recover from the aftermath of the 2011 events. And it's like I'm a new mom now, and I've just had my baby, so...
her baby is right outside. Maybe you'll get a chance to see him.
His father is actually being my babysitter. Somewhere in the audience he is. It's like you have to deliver the baby. So it's like we're in the push phase now, and there's a lot of pain involved, but once the baby is out, hopefully a healthy one, we'll take care of it, and we will be part of making the new Yemen and shaping it so that it becomes the Yemen that we aspire.
Let's talk about the United States for a second. I'm an American. The United States obviously plays a critical role in your part of the world. And I wonder if you could comment about to what degree it's been positive, but to what degree it's actually complicated these developments by maintaining support for autocratic regimes. I mean, it's very difficult, and we're here in a country where the United States is an enormous influence, sometimes for good, but often for ill. Talk to us about the influence of the United States in Yemeni development.
Well, we, as many of the other countries around the world, have been watching, for example, the elections just on Tuesday very carefully, because we follow the saying, if the United States catches a cold, the whole world sneezes. So what we're doing is that we're closely following up who's going to take power, because it influences how our country is run. For the last 33 years, former President Saleh was considered an ally for the U.S. in the war against terrorism. And unfortunately, under the pretext of fighting terrorism, a lot of breaches against human rights were taking place by the authorities themselves, who were getting a lot of support from the U.S. government. So while the U.S. government was helping the anti-terrorism unit, a lot of protesters who were asking for democracy were actually shot. In fact, as a journalist, we have photographs of the bullets that were used against the protesters. Written on it was written "Made in USA." So I have a picture, I wish I brought it, where one of the protesters was holding this shell casing, and it says "Made in USA." So sometimes the support from the U.S. to governments is used the wrong way, and talk about drones, for example.
Let me ask you about that. Talking about made in USA, many people don't realize there's so much focus on drones, for example, in Afghanistan, Pakistan. There are also drones now in Yemen, some of which are killing innocent civilians. So
there is a place south of Yemen called Abiyan, where Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is supposed to have take place or have an operational center or something of the sort. And we knew about this for the last 3 decades, but suddenly every now and then there's a drone and there are some killings. The problem is that you cannot fight terrorism with weapons. You cannot use a gun and kill terrorism, because terrorism is an ideology. You cannot. It's not written on somebody's head that I'm a terrorist. So if we kill one terrorist, another guy comes in, and a third guy. And what we need to do is that we need to change. We need to change the mentality of people. We have to find the real reasons why people become terrorists and help them with that. And it's usually a poverty issue. It's an economical background. And this is what most of the governments fail to realize.
I want to ask one quick question and then ask you to take a minute and give any parting thoughts to this wonderful audience. We talked about you being a bridge. You also mentioned your staff wearing, some cases, veils or headscarves. You wear a headscarf. And my guess is that it's not as common for Mexicans to see women wearing headscarves. As a bridge from the old to the new, how do you see this issue of veil and headscarf?
Well, I personally have a very strong conviction against covering the face, because it's your identity. I mean, the headscarf is relatively easier to absorb, because you can wear a hat, you can wear a wig, you can wear whatever. It doesn't really matter what color your hair is. Your face is the most important thing. People need to see your face, especially if you're a reporter or a teacher or just a person. People need to associate. And I've been trying to advocate this among my staff. And a lot of Yemeni women would love to take off the veil and just breathe the air directly, if their families would allow. So it's more of a cultural thing than it is a choice by women. And this is what I advocate for, Elliot. I try to help Yemeni women become empowered so that they are in control of their own body, in control of what they dress, and in control of what they say. And this is what we hope the new generation of Yemen will lead to.
Well, Nadia, you're an inspiration for the young women and the young men of not just Yemen, but the entire world. And we're absolutely delighted that you were here.
Thank you.
Would you like just a brief final thought?
Thank you for allowing me to share this amazing event and be here. It's my first time in Mexico, and I feel that I relate a lot with my culture and my experience and my country as an emerging democracy. And I ask you, I beg you, not to judge me or my country. Read more about Yemen, go online and ask the right questions, because stereotype is the worst thing on earth, and we need to break the stereotypes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias, muchas gracias. Un aplauso.